This is CS50 Week 1 section on C, so if this is what you were expecting to hear, you're definitely in the right place. My name is Yulia. I'm a preceptor here at Harvard. Here's my email address if you have any questions or would like to get in touch. I was actually some years ago a TA at Yale, where we also teach CS50, and now I joined the team on the Harvard side and helping them out with the Harvard College class here on campus and also supporting all of our students online. So as I mentioned just now, this is week 1 of CS50 and we're going to talk about C. So this is really where everything begins, and we're going to dive into some building blocks that are really going to help us throughout the whole semester. And some things on the agenda for today are variables and operators. So the most basic things that we need to get started. We're going to talk about functions. What are functions? What parameters functions use, right? How to define functions, how to use them. We're going to chat about conditionals and loops, so something that will be really handy in our problem set, and again, just like one of those like stepping stones to get us through the next weeks. And we'll get a little taste of problem set 1. We're going to talk about Mario, how to build those bricks and stack a little nice pyramid. So without further ado, let's get started and let's talk about variables, types, input, and printing. So you might recall that during lecture we talked about a phone book, right? Professor Malan showed an example where if we're looking for some contact or a person, we might flip through the pages, or we might go to the middle and use a more efficient algorithm of finding that person. Well, today we're taking sort of like a step down from the idea of searching to how are those phone books comprised? Like, what are the components of those? So you might imagine that one of the variables in a phone book is called calls, right? So maybe it is the number of calls that one of your friend called you, right? And maybe they called you 4 times. So you can imagine having this like square or a little box that stores some value, in this case 4, and it is called calls. So what actually is going on like underneath the hood, right? Like what is the code that enables us to have this little square with number 4? Well, it can look a little cryptic for now, but we will parse it together. So in order to get this box with number 4 in it, the line of code we would use is int calls equals 4, right? And as such, there are sort of like 4 components to it. The first one is name, right? Variable name, and it can be whatever sort of like word or phrase you would prefer, sort of like calls or name, age, address, you're going to see a little later. Next one is type, right? This is very important. We need to tell C exactly what type of value it should expect to receive on its end. So in this case, it is integer, right? Like to specify just like a number that doesn't have any floating points, just one number, right? Integer. Then the value itself, right? Like if we created this box that is called calls and we're supposed to put an integer into it, we're going to put 4 into it. Like that is our value. And lastly, sort of like what brings everything together is the assignment operator, the equal sign. And you might also read it like this. Create an integer named calls that gets the value, that gets the value 4, right? Combining all of our 4 components together to create this variable. Okay. All right, so let's practice one more time. Maybe someone in the chat could type in sort of like a similar definition that we just saw, right? We have int x equal sign and 50. How could we combine it in sort of like one sentence in a way that we saw earlier here? Someone in the chat, if you guys want to type it out. So we have integer x equals 50. How can we sort of like bring it all together into one sentence? All right, seeing none, but this is how you would say it, right? Create an integer named x that gets the value 50, right? Just reading left to right. Yeah, Dado, exactly. Create an integer named x that gets the value 50. So creating these kind of like sentences in your head, right, and relating code to like plain English or whatever language you are studying CS in can really help you get through, you know, these first few steps of getting used to how to write code and how to phrase it properly. Well, let's take it a step further. So what if my friend called me another time, right? Like they just gave me a call and now the value is, of course, it should be 5. So how can I change that? Well, we can use a simple reassignment, right? So in the beginning, if we created int calls equals 4, right? That is our initial box we created. And then we want to assign it to 5. What we can do is just have a second line of code where we specify, well, now the value of calls should be 5 and not 4, and therefore the value inside of our box will change as well. And again, sort of like translating it to plain English, the way that it would look like is calls, the variable name, gets 5, right? Combining the name, the assignment operator, and the value together. Well, what if it's not just like a plain number, right? Like what if we want to make some changes? Like for example, like incrementing by 1 every time my friend or my mom gives me a call. Well, we can also use different operations as we're reassigning. So for example, if we want to add +1, we can do that on the second line. So calls equals calls +1, right? Or if we want to subtract 1, it would be very similar, but calls -1. But it gets a little confusing, right? When we have like calls equals calls -1, right? It's just like, how can I take calls and then assign it back to calls? Like this is where it gets a little confusing, but actually what's going on, we're first taking a look at the right-hand side, right? Like we're grabbing our value 4 that was in our little box before. And so we're doing the operation 4 -1, which will be 3, and then sort of like assigning it back to our variable calls in such a way, creating the new box that contains value 3. And you can also use multiplication and division, sort of like the same idea of grabbing the initial value that we had and changing it and reassigning it. We could also do, I see someone in the chat saying we can also do calls ++ if we just want to increment by 1. ++ is a very useful operator. We will see it shortly when we're talking about for loops. But let me pause here for a second and ask, what questions do we have about, variables, reassignment, operators? This was sort of like our first chunk of information. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Okay, maybe let's give it a few more seconds. Yeah, and feel free to put any questions you have in the chat throughout, and then I'll try to take a little peek and then address them as we go. Alrighty, seeing none, so let's move on. So say I didn't have that number of calls stored in the phone book just yet. I wanted to get it from the user. So how could we do that, right? Like how can we get input from the user? Well, there are a few ways we can do it. In this case, if we're trying to get an input that is a number, right, an integer, we might want to use a function called getInt. And again, the way that it's structured, we can break it down in several components. We are starting with our function, right? So this is the tool that will allow us to grab this input from the user and then store it in our proverbial box. So if we have function getInt, what it takes in, coming back a little bit, the first part is the function name, right? Like getInt is something that was defined before. It was actually defined by CS50, and this is in the library CS50x that you can also read a little bit more about. But someone, once upon a time, wrote this function that we now can use to grab these values. Inside of the function is function input. In this case, it is calls, right? So we're prompting the user to input the number of calls in the terminal that we can then later use. And then our next component is talking about like, okay, so we've looked at the code for this function, but how does this actually work, right? Like a lot of moving pieces. So we can imagine this box that represents the getInt function, right? So something will go into the box and something will come out of the box. So what goes into the box? What goes in the box is prompt, right? So in this case, it is calls. And what we get out from it is some kind of number that is stored in the variable calls. Or if we give a specific example, that could be quote unquote calls, colon, space, like to give space for our user. And then we get back 4 that we will then store in our variable. And this is again, right, where we come back to like assignment. So we got this number 4 back. So like what is actually going on? We're gonna take this value and then we're gonna store it in the calls variable. So zooming out again, we created an integer named calls that gets the value 4, right? So before this 4 was even on the picture, we had this whole getInt function where we prompted the user, we got the number back, and now we're using this return value to store it in the variable calls. So again, coming back to our idea of having this little box that stores some kind of number. Okay, I see a question. I have a question about format codes. What's the difference between %I and %D? That's a great question. So %I and %D are interchangeable. They're both used for integers if you want to print them out, which is a perfect segue because we're going to talk about printing values in just a second. But %D is a little deprecated and we've been using %I since, so definitely default to that. But as someone mentioned in the chat, like how to print out values, right? So for example, we had our value int calls 4, and now we want to print it out. Well, for that, we can use function printf, and so we can have our string, right? So just printing out the number doesn't really mean anything. It is nice to give some kind of like context. So in quotes, we can put calls equals, and then %I would be the placeholder for our variable. Because if we did something like calls equals calls, well, that's just text, right? It wouldn't really print out calls equals 4. It's just going to print out calls equals calls, right? That's not what we want. So to avoid that, we're going to have our placeholder or format code. So %I is one of the options that's used for integers. And then the second component is having the value, right? Like the variable that stores the value that we want to print out. So putting these pieces together. And there are other types in format codes. So for example, for numbers, we can also use floats. For that, in that case, it would be %F. For text, we'll be looking into chars and strings in just a second. And then true or false, they're like Boolean, type of Boolean, right? We're using %I as well. Okay, so next we're actually going to write our own program. So if you want to pull up CS50.dev with me right now or just follow along, feel free to do that. But I'm going to pause again and take questions, any questions that folks have right now. Questions on printing, types, functions, variables, anything that we just touched upon. Okay, seeing none, but definitely feel free to pop them into the chat as we're tagging along. But let's move over to CS50.dev now, which is our environment where we write codes. Where can I write programs was a question in the chat. That's a great question. So for that, we use CS50.dev, which is the Visual Studio Code for CS50. It's sort of this like virtual IDE where students and teachers and really anyone could use to get started with programming, write their own programs. It is a simplified version of the desktop visual code that might be familiar to someone and should be really easy to use and get started. Well, let's go back to the problem we're trying to solve. We're gonna write a program that prints out hello world, which is also first step of problem set 0. So we can start checking off some boxes on our list of programs to complete. So to start, let's create this program and I'm gonna call it hello. So I'm going to create a file called hello.c. And again, there are, several components that go into writing a program. The first one is including the libraries. So I'm going to include standard io.h. This will allow me to run my program. And then I'm going to create a function, a main function, right? Like int main void. So in every program you're going to write in this course and probably in the future, there's going to be a main function, right? Like the main component of your program that's going to be responsible for things. And inside of it, let's use the printf function that we just saw earlier in the slides. And what we're going to do, we're going to print out hello world, okay? Semicolon. And those are a little tricky, and odds are you'll probably forget it not once, not twice, probably many more times, but it is just getting into the habit of it. So let's go back to the terminal and now run make hello to compile. Okay, compiles, and now we're gonna run hello, and oh, right, it's not pretty. It's on the same line with my $sign. So how could I fix that? Like, how can I separate it into a new line right here? Exactly. So I can use \n, which will give me a new line. And I'm going to run hello again. Not working. Okay. What step am I missing here? I added my escape character now. I added the new line, but I'm keep running hello, and it's exactly, I need to make hello again. So every time you make any changes, make sure you make the program again so that all the changes are now reflected. And boom, we have hello world right here in our terminal on its own line. Okay. Any questions about this? This is sort of like one of those like first programs that everyone's write, the hello world one. And I think even though it's a little simple, there's still mistakes you can make, right? Like there's the new line character you might forget, or the semicolon, or even including the library. So you can feel a little proud of yourself even for getting that far. Question in the chat, there's another types like \n. Yeah, so this is sort of like the escape character that we were just talking about. So for certain things, you will need that. For example, if I wanted to use quotes like around hello, right? I can't just put double quotes by themselves because the program is going to read it as if I'm just trying to, like create like a separate string. What I could do is use an escape character and then put hello in the quotes in such a way. So let's show it, make hello, hello. So now I have my quotes run hello. Let me get rid of this so that we can go back to what we saw before. I'm gonna make hello again, run it, okay, hello world. Now let's go back to our slides and see the next thing we're going to accomplish is let's write a program hello me or hello your name to complete the second step of problem set 0. Going back to CS50x now, and let's keep editing just in this file hello.c. So my name is Yulia, and I could just do hello Yulia, right? I'm going to make hello, I'm going to run hello, hello Yulia, right? So there's a trick, like this is it, the program is done. We can now move on to our next challenge. What could we change here to actually make it say hello name, like right, hello Danielle. Exactly, we can get user input. So instead of just like hard coding Yulia, like baking it inside of my code, I can do something different. I can again get input from the user. So for that, I'm going to create a variable called name, and it's going to have type string, right, which is what we use for words. I'm going to use another function called getString, very similar to getInt. It's just meant to getting strings from users, not integers. And then I'm going to ask, what is your name? Leaving space, not forgetting about the semicolon. And then here I'm going to say hello name. Okay, make hello. Oh, Okay, here's our first error, right? They're super cryptic, right? This is a lot, like use of undeclared identifier, did you mean start at IN, da, da, da. Very cryptic. Nika is saying include CS50, exactly. Great thinking. So what I didn't mention earlier when we were talking about get ints is that they're coming from the CS50 library. So for that, I'm going to include CS50.h. Okay, and so this will allow us to use now string and get string to get users input. So let's make hello again. Let's run hello. What is your name, Yulia? Uh-oh. Hello name. Isn't it supposed to print hello, Yulia? What is going on here? Okay, Nika's saying percent as, but where does exactly the percent as go? Okay, after me, exactly. Instead of name. Perfect. Yeah, you guys are so good at it. So instead of just baking in, just like string name inside of my input of printf, I actually want to make it like dynamic, right? I want to be able to change it. So for that, I'm going to go back to our like placeholders or these like percent operators. And after the comma, I'm going to put name, right? So what I'm saying is the text itself is going to be hello, comma, space, and then I'm saving a placeholder for a value stored in variable name that is of type string, right? So you see how these pieces are sort of like connecting between each other. String name, variable name is of type string, so we use a percent s operator, right? All these pieces are connected together. So now let's make hello again. Let's run it. What is your name, Yulia? Yay, okay, so this is going well. Let's try it again. Hello, what is your name? For example, David. Hello, David. All right, so let me scroll. I see some questions in the chat, so let me scroll and see. Gigi saying, can you explain what percent s does? Yeah, totally. So remember how just now when we were talking about integers, right? Like we had our placeholder for I so that we can print out variables calls. So we can't really just like bake in calls equals calls, right? We have to create some kind of like placeholder to have this like dynamic interaction between the variable and grabbing the value. So similar thing is going on here. We want to make sure that we have the placeholder for our variable name so that like whatever user types in, like David, Daniel, Andrew, Bob, doesn't matter. Like we can put it inside of our string that is ultimately in printf. Okay, let's see what other questions we have. All right. Okay, any other questions about this program? Hello me or hello world? Okay. Alrighty, seeing none. So let's move on to our next exercise. So next what we're gonna do is create a program that stores and prints out some information like name, age, phone, number, can be address or hometown of your friends. Like so adding some more layers to our hello me problem. So for that, let's create a new file called friends.c. Alrighty, it opened up here in the terminal. Let's create sort of like the same steps that we've done before. So we want to include standard io.h library. We want to have int main void curly braces. Okay, so what we're going to do next is like sort of few steps. So let's try to think what attributes my friends can have, right? So the first one was name. That's easy. That's something that we just talked about. What other things can we ask our friends to input? Age, yeah, so maybe age. Height, yeah, that's a good one. Let's maybe do hometown. Okay, and maybe Let's do phone number. All right. So as you might see, these are commented out, right? Like these are not lines of code. These are not doing anything. These are comments. And the way you can do them is by doing 2 slashes in a row. So for get name, we're going to do something very similar that we just did in Hello C, right? Like string name, get string, what is your name? So let's do just that. So I'm going to create a variable called string name, get string. I'm going to ask, what is your name? Semicolon. For age now, I'm going to use an integer. So, oops, I'm going to do int age equals get int. What is your age? Okay, semicolon. Same for hometown. I'm going to say string hometown, get string. What is your hometown? Semicolon. And then for phone number, I'm going to do int number equals get string, get int. What is your phone number? Okay. And I think I forgot to include CS50 library again, so let's not make the same mistake. Let's come back and put it here on top. Okay, let's start with this, right? Like, let's make sure we can grab our variables. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, good eyes. Forgot to include the library. So let's make this first and then see if we're getting any errors. Fingers crossed, none. That's awesome. And then let's run it to see if we're getting all the right inputs that we want. So what is your name? Julia. What is your age? 22. What is your hometown? Cambridge. And then what is your phone number? I'm going to say 1111111. Okay, so it didn't like it. Let me do this again. So it's for prompting me again. What's going on here? Why can I not put in my phone number? Oh wait, it's a fake phone number, right? But yeah, exactly. So parentheses doesn't count as an int, we need a string. So notice how on line 16 right here, I defined number, like the variable is going to call, excuse me. I define number, the variable that's going to store my phone number as an int. But there's a lot of different formats in which you can write it. Like surely you could have done like 111, 111, 1111. This works, right? But what if I want to include the parentheses and the dashes? So since we're not going to do like any mathematical operations with the number, it is totally fine to just store it in a string and allow for those different formats to come in. So let's make this again. Let's make the terminal slightly bigger. Make friends. Let's run it. Okay, Julia, 22. Cambridge. Now let's try this format again. Oh, yay. Now it works. Okay, awesome. So changing it to the string did the trick. Now we can put whatever formats we want. Let me pause here for a second. Any questions about how we just got all these user inputs? Yeah, so Paula said, why do we define the output for main as int? That is a great question, and actually Professor Malan is going to address it in the coming lectures, but this is sort of like a conventional way to write main functions, right? So it doesn't necessarily take anything as an input, so that's why we leave it as void, but we do expect to get a number from it, and you can notice that here we're not actually returning anything, right? Like even the printf, like the printf action is not actually returning a value, right? It's like more of a side effect that we have in the terminal, but good question. Daniel said, will casting work in this context? In the context of putting in the user's input, probably no, right? Because we can't even like cast something that we haven't received yet. So we want to make sure we are defining the correct variables right away. Tatia said when we use two slashes, that's when we want to define, to create comments, right? So like right here, when I'm just leaving like little hints for myself, right? To remember what I was typing. Let's move along and now print it out. So we have all these users input that we just got. Now let's put it all together. So let's create a sort of a lengthy sentence where we're going to say, my new friend's name is %s. And then I'm going to say, comma, %i for age. They are from %s again because I'm using hometown now. And their phone number is %s again, right? So now we sort of like need to match it back together. So the first %s was referring to a name. The next %s was referring to an age. The third one was referring to hometown. And the second one was referring to number, right? So you can sort of like, again, see how all these things come back together. So we started off by creating user's input. So by grabbing user's input, creating variables name, age, hometown, number, storing them in the variables appropriate types, and then we're printing out all of these variables in a sentence by using these placeholders. So let's make this. So make friends. Oops, I forgot a semicolon. See, I told you it was going to happen at some point, and it happened to me. So let's do it again. So make friends. Okay, it compiles. Friends. Let's run it. What is your name? Yulia. What is your age? 22. What is your hometown? Cambridge. What is your phone number? 111-111-1111. Okay. My new friend's name is Yulia, 22. They're from Cambridge, and their phone number is 1111, lots of ones. Okay, and I think I'm forgetting a new line because I see that my ones are now getting on the next one. So I'm just going to create that here. Let me compile it again. What's your name? Yulia, 22, Cambridge, 111. Okay, so still going a little bit over the line, but that is the program that we just wrote. Okay, let me bring the terminal down a little bit. And said, what's the difference between %s and %i? That's a great question. So you notice how here we define name as string and then hometown as string and then number as string as well. These are sort of like text or like words. And this is exactly why we want to create these different placeholders to distinguish between the different types that we have. So placeholder S is for strings or words, and placeholder I is for integers, which is just kind of numbers. Okay. Gigi said, what does make file name do? So when we do something like make friends or make hello, what it does, it takes the machine code, right, and compiles it. Oh, sorry, it takes the source code and compiles it into machine code, right, so that the computer can actually read it. And we will see different kind of variations of this. For example, Python is an interpretive language, like we don't need to compile it before we run it. Sort of like the computer does that for us, but C is a little bit more like lower controlled language. So we want to make sure we are making or compiling the program first before we actually run it. But great questions. Okay. All right, let's move on. So we've talked about return types and printing. Now let's go into our next part of loops and conditionals. So let's talk about conditionals first, right? So you might see something like this. If calls less than 1, printf call more often, right? But what is actually going on here? Well, again, several components to it, right? It's just like Legos, it's like building blocks. So the first one is Boolean expression. We're checking some kind of condition, right? Like we're taking that variable calls where we are storing 4 or 5 or any other value. We're checking if it is less than 1 in this case. If the expression is true, we're then going inside of our conditional, right? Like these curly braces that are hugging our printf statement. If the Boolean expression is actually true, we're going to execute this conditional code. So if calls is less than 1, if it's like 0, or maybe even negative, which is probably not possible, but we're going to printf call more often, right? If we have multiple situations that we would like to address, this is where else statements come in. So the first one can still be if calls is less than 1, right? This is our like first condition that we want to check. And then else sort of like takes care of all the other options, right? So if calls is not less than 1, we want to print f thanks for calling. So it means that calls is either 1 or more. So the Boolean expression was indeed false, and we jumped to our next part of code. And these are mutually exclusive, right? So either one or the other can happen, and they're separated by this else in the middle. All right. Shahab asked, referring to the previous exercise, in sake of style, is it better to print off every information separate line? That's a great question. Yeah, you could have noticed that my line was getting a little long, right? Like it was kind of going off screen. It depends on the situations, right? Sometimes you want to print out everything in one go, and then with sort of like in the terminal jump between the lines, but sometimes you want to print it out in different printf statements, and that's totally fine as well. All right. Let's move into loops. So next we're going to talk about while loops and for loops. And let's start with while loops. Again, we're going to break down some of the components. And the first one that we have going top to bottom is initialization, right? So we're creating this variable I, and we're setting it to 0. That's going to be our count, right? Like it's going to be the variable that helps us make sure we're doing the right number of repetitions or loops. So the next part is Boolean expression, right? Like something that we just saw. The comparison is going on, right? We're going to get either true or false. And if it is true, we're going to go into our next chunk, right? Like in the code that is hugged by these curly braces. So if the Boolean expression is indeed correct, we're going to go inside of our while conditional, and I'm missing a step here. We are first going to go into printf, right? We're still going top to bottom. So we're going to do printf, we're going to print out I in the first iteration, right? It's going to be 0, and then we're going to increment bumping an I by 1, and then going into the Boolean expression again. So let's visualize it. So right, again, let's go back to our boxes. Let's try to picture these things in our heads. So again, we're starting with int I equals 0. We're creating this box. We're storing value 0. Second part is I less than 1. And it's sort of like this like message or idea that is going on. Like, right, nothing gets printed out, nothing gets returned or changed in this step, but it's still a step that we need to make. So we're asking ourselves, is I less than 2? And I is less than 2, it's 0. So then we're going inside the curly braces. We're going to printf, right, print out the value that I currently has, which is 0. And next step, we're going to increment I by 1. And as someone said before, another way to do it is I++. Both formats are correct. Next, we're going to go back to our Boolean expression. Note that we're not going back to int I equals 0. Like we've done that step, we're past it. We're now coming back to the Boolean expression. We ask ourselves, is I less than 2? Well, I is 1, so yes, it is true. We're going back inside, we're printing out I, which is in this case 1, and now we're incrementing I by 1 again. And now repeating the process again and again. So is I less than 2? Well, I is not less than 2, right? Like I is 2. So our Boolean expression is false, and now we will finish the program, right? Like we're going to be past this while loop and just left with what's on the right. Okay. So what are some other ways that we could do things? So let's consider this block inside, right? Like the printf and the I++. Let's try translating it into for loops, like one of our other tools that we have. So notice how we're still grabbing the printf portion, right? Like that is the part of code that's going to go with us to the for loops. And going to the next slide, we see exactly that. So we kept the printf part, and now the first line looks very cryptic, like what is going on? I see I++, it looks kind of similar, I less than 2, but completely different format, right? It's actually all of the same things that we just saw in the previous slide, right? So just like with the while loops, we're defining int I equals 0. Just as with while loops, we're setting up our Boolean expression, which is I less than 2, and just as while loops, we're incrementing I++. So we can think about it in the same ways that we did with while loops, the initialization, the Boolean expression, and the increment, and then ultimately we will print f our I in this case, right? So still going through the steps of initializing I to 0, leaving it aside, and then going into the for loop, printing out I one by one until we reach false with our Boolean expression. Okay, before we jump to the next part, which is actually talking about Mario, one of the problems on the problem set, what questions do we have about conditionals, for loops, or while loops? I'm going to stop here to look at the chat. What is the do loop syntax? I think you're referring to the do while loop, and we'll actually see it in just a second because we're going to talk about it as we're writing Mario. Good question. Any other questions about for loop, conditionals, while loops? Yeah, so Remy says what to use what in these. So it really depends on sort of like what you're trying to accomplish. And as you just saw, they're pretty interchangeable. We can use either while loops or for loops. Either or is fine. But the way that I like to think about it, you want to use for loops when you know the exact number of steps you want to take, right? Like you know that you're going to take 2 steps, you can set the Boolean expression correctly and easily. And with the while loop, sort of like a more fluid, right? Like in this case, right, it is very similar. We can translate while loop into the for loop easily, but sometimes we don't know the exact like I is less than 2, right? Like maybe it's some other condition. Maybe it's like, is it empty? Is some variable empty, or like have we reached like the end of something? So with while you have more freedom to play around with different Boolean expressions that you want to set, versus for loops are more strict in that sense. Like, right, you have to have like 2, 3, 4 count. All right, so let's move on and let's talk about Mario, which I think is everyone's favorite problem set, and it's a lot of fun. But the problem at hand that we have is that if you are not familiar, Mario is a video game where a character called Mario hops around this imaginary world that is built of like bricks and other things. So one of the images from the game is sort of this like pyramid, right? That goes like dun dun dun, step by step, which is exactly what we'll try to build today. So we will not build such a fancy image as we see here, but we would want to build something like this, right? Like a right-sided pyramid that goes up in a similar way as it does on the image. But let's start with a left-aligned pyramid first. Like this will be a little easier to tackle. And for that, let's go back to our VS Code. I'm going to clear the terminal and I'm going to create, I'm going to create a new file called Mario. All right, I'm going to close these friends. I'm going to clear the terminal. Okay. So again, building blocks, right? Like we have to make sure we're including all the necessary things for a program to run. And let's start with our headers. So we're going to start with standard io.h. I already know that I will need the CS50 library. So I'm going to include that as well. I'm going to create int main void, our main function. Okay. And then inside this main function, I'm going to leave some comments for myself just to help me guide through this process. So the first one will be prompt user for input. So as we saw here, the pyramid can be different sizes, right? So in this case, the pyramid is of height 6, but it can be of height 5, 4, 3, 2. We will leave this up to the user. Then the second steps and print a pyramid. Print a pyramid of that height. Oh, so many typos. All right. Well, this is simple, right? 2 steps. Why do we make such a big deal out of it, right? It's just 2 steps. But it takes time, right? Like it takes, again, building blocks and components to make this work. So the first one we've tackled before, so we can deal with this right away. So let's call it int height, and I'm going to print... I'm going to prompt my user for an integer, and I was like, and I'm going to say, what is the height of the pyramid? Question mark, leave space, semicolon. Okay. Next, we want to print a pyramid of that height, right? And that's where things get a little bit tricky. How can we go from 0 to 100? Like, right, how can we go from knowing just how to print maybe 1 hash at a time to printing multiple? And I think you just saw me giving away the next slide a little bit, but let's work on this together. All right, so again, building blocks. Let's start with the idea of like printing a row, right? So I want to print 1 row at a time, and this is what I'm going to start with. And for that, I'm going to create a separate helper function. So I'm going to call it print row, and it has return type void and the input void, because we're not taking, oh, sorry, we're going to return type void, but we're actually going to take in something, right? We want to make sure that we're printing different length, right? Our rows have to be different. So we're going to put in the variable called int bricks, right? Tell me how many bricks I need to print on each row. And here, what I'm going to do is printf hashtag, right? Okay. And then in here, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to say print row for semicolon. So we've created a function, print row, that will take in the variable int bricks, we'll print some hashes, and the way I know how many bricks to print is by passing in this value here. So let me make Mario, and I am running into the first issue. So call to undeclared function to print row. How do I tackle this one? Oh, beyond forgetting this guy, yes. But how do I tackle the error? Exactly. I also need to make sure I prototype it ahead of main. So what I'm going to do, and as Professor Malan says, this is the only acceptable time that you can copy paste in CS50, but I'm going to copy this guy and put it on the very top before my main even starts. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I'm reading my program top to bottom. So I'm going inside of main, and I'm going through line 9, I'm getting input from the user, and I'm getting to line 12. And without this prototype, main does not know what print row is. Like, right, it can't like look ahead and jump below it. It just sees what it is, what it has right now and what it's seen before. So in order to avoid these errors, we have to prototype this function before. Let's try to make it again. So make Mario. Okay, it compiles. That's a good sign. And now we're going to run it. What is the head of the pyramid? For example, 5. Okay. I'm getting just 1 hash sign. This is not at all what I wanted to do, right? Okay, I'm seeing some suggestions in the chat. This was solving our scope issue. Okay. Someone seems to put the entire solution in the chat already, but let's take it step by step, okay? So right now I'm just sort of like printing our hash once. What I really want to do is have some kind of for loop, right? Like do it multiple times. And for that, I'm going to do because this int I equals 0, right? This is how we initialize it. We're gonna print out like some number of bricks, right? And bricks is exactly the variable that gives us that information. So I'm going to set I less than bricks. And I'm going increment I at every step. I'm going to move printf hashtag inside of the for loop, indent it. Let's make Mario again. Okay. Height of the pyramid, let's say 4. Okay. It's printing out 4 hashes, so that's a good sign. But what if I want to make 5 hashes? Still printing out 4. Where is my mistake here? Why does it keep printing out 4 hashes even if I put 5 as a user? Any suggestions? So I can see that, yeah, exactly. I have print row 4. So I don't want to hard code the number, right? Like I want to make it dynamic. So I'm going to change it to height. In this way, whatever user input puts in, I will be able to dynamically change that. So let's make Mario again. And let's run it. What is the height of the pyramid? Let's say 6. And I'm seeing 6 hashes. Okay, that's a good sign. But again, I'm missing the new line, right? Like that's just so annoying. So I'm going to go in here and create a new line. And so I'm going to make Mario, what's height of the pyramid? 5. Ugh, this is not what I wanted again, right? Like it's printing out in the column. I still want it in the row. What can I do different? How can I change this? Create a new line at the end of the loop. Exactly. So instead of creating sort of like a new line every time I go through my for loop, what I'm going to do is just printf a new line right here. Let's make Mario, oops, semicolon, make Mario, run Mario. What is the height of the pyramid? 5. Okay. We have a row. We have a row, people. This is awesome. So this is one of the first steps in our mission of creating a Mario pyramid, okay? So what we did so far is created a separate function called print row. We created a for loop in which we print out hashes. We also print out a new line every time we finish that for loop. And then we've already pre-set up some of those building blocks inside of the main function. I'm going to pause right here for a second and ask, what questions do we have about these steps so far? What questions do we have about this code, the way we used our various tools? Any questions about this so far? All right, seeing none. So let's keep moving along. So let me just run this one more time to illustrate what we're tackling here. So right now I'm just printing out one row at a time, right? But I want to have this it's like a stepping stone construction, right? Like I want to have multiple rows. So how can I do that? Well, we're going to make use of the for loops again. So instead of just calling print row function one time, we can call it multiple times, again, using our for loops. So in here, I'm going to create for int I equals 0. I is less than height, I plus plus, and then inside of the for loop, I'm going to move this line of code right here. Okay, let's make Mario. What is height of the pyramid? 4. Okay, so this is resembling what we need to do a little better. So just having 4x4 sort of grid, like a little square. Okay, let's say a question in the chat. in the print row int bricks and declaring type of variable int is why we can manipulate the row by using inputs with int height. Yeah, so there are different functions sort of like have different variables that they use. So even though we put in height right here, we can, we're referencing bricks inside of the print row because that is the variable that is the variable that is defined within the scope of print row, and therefore if my height and bricks just like match of where I want them to match, right, on the print row input, I can just be using bricks inside of my function because this is what I defined earlier. Okay, so here's the issue, and let me propose that we can solve it, but we have a 4x4 grid. And it just seems to be like doing the same thing over and over again, right? Like it prints 4 hashes 4 times. It's very like static, right? It's sort of like almost constant, except for the fact that we can get a different input from the user. How can we make it more dynamic, right? What is the variable inside our main function that will give us this like dynamic option? What is the variable inside our main function that keeps changing with every iteration? Remy said, replace height with I. Exactly. So you can notice that inside of our main function, we have 2 variables, height and I. And in fact, height, after the user inputted that number, that is it, right? Like that is where it stays. It does not change. But I, on the other hand, changes with every iteration of the for loop, right? Like it increments by 1 every time. So let's do just that. Let's make Mario. Let's run Mario. What does it have to permit for? Okay, this is looking a little better, but I would say that I'm still missing something. What am I missing here? The height with pyramid is supposed to be 4, so I should see 1, 2, 3, 4, but I'm just seeing 1, 2, 3. I'm missing 1 row. Yeah, exactly. But how do I fix that? Like, how do I make it 4 rows where I needed? Any suggestions of how we can change this code? Okay, so seeing some options. I is less than height plus 1. Okay, but I will sort of just like stop it, right? But like I'm missing something on the very first row, right? Like I'm not printing out anything on the first row. So maybe we can notice that in the beginning, we initialize I to 0, right? Like this is where we initialize it for the first time, I is equal to 0. So when I do print row for the first time, I'm actually doing print row 0. So naturally, it's going to go inside of the print row function, and it's going to be I is less than 0, but wait, int I equals 0, I is less than 0, right? Like this will not work. So on the first iteration, print row function is actually not going to print anything. So we need to make some changes. And for that, to solve that, we can do I plus 1, right? So instead of starting at I equals 0, we can start at I 1. And let's make Mario. Let's run it. With height pyramid 4. And voila. I have my left-sided pyramid that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Exactly as we intended. Your task now is to make it go the other way, right? Flip it. Make it a right-sided pyramid. But that you will tackle in your problem set. And let me propose just one more thing. So, for example, what happens if I do /Mario and then I say -2? The pyramid is not printing. Well, you can't really print out a pyramid of -2, right? But I also don't want the program to kick me out completely, right? Like I want to give me another chance. Like maybe the next integer that I was going to put in was actually going to be a good integer, a positive integer. How can I fix that? What can I do differently? Yeah, Shahab is saying a do-while loop. Exactly. And this is where I promised I'm going to show you how the do-while loop works. So we can do just that. In the very beginning, we're going to create a variable int height. And then later, we're going to use our do while loop. And the way that it is set up is a little quirky, right? A little different from what we saw. So first, you're going to define the do action, right? Like something that has to happen. And then the second part is the condition, your Boolean expression, like while something is true, do X. So we're going to say height is less than 1, right? So this is sort of like the contrary of what we're trying to accomplish. So as long as height is less than 1, write 0, -2, -5. Keep prompting the user for the right input, right? Like do not stop until they give you the right input. So I'm going to move this guy inside of the do while loop. I'm going to delete int in front of height because we've already done that on line 9. And I'm going to make it, so make Mario. Oops, I forgot a semicolon. I'm going to run Mario. I'm going to say -2, -5, 0, 4. Okay, so this is now working as intended. You see that it did not stop until I gave it the right input. It kept re-prompting me until I gave it the right thing. Any questions about Mario, the do while loops, for loops, sort of like the logic of how we arrived to this solution? Any questions about this part? Yes, I can go to the bottom. Any questions at all? Alrighty, seeing none. So let's go back and actually do a quick recap, right, of the print row function. So we just wrote it and we already talked about it. Let's briefly consider again, what are the components that go into it? So we had our setup of void print row in bricks, right? We're printing out one row of bricks at a time. And again, just a good habit of breaking down things as you go. So the first part is return type, right? As we said, print row does not return anything, it just has a side effect of printing something. Then the function name, print row, which again can be whatever you choose it to be. Then the next is input, right? Int bricks is what we pass into our print row function. And then lastly is some kind of like action that we're going to take, which is print row of bricks. And again, coming back to our like visualization, our boxes. So if print row is a box, right? And something is happening here. So what we pass into this box is bricks, right? So it is the variable that we grab from the user or that we like defined earlier in main. We pass it into print row, and what we get out of it is a row of bricks, right? Depending on the size of it. So more specifically, if we had if bricks equaled 3, right? 3 bricks, what we get out is these 3 hashes in the end of using print row function. All right, this was a lot, so I'm gonna pause again and ask if folks have any questions about return types, printing, placeholders, for loops, conditionals, Mario. We've done so many things today. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to type them in the chat in the next minute or so. All right, not seeing any questions, so this is where we're going to wrap up. So this was CS50 week 1 section. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're gonna be here every week at the same time. Feel free to log into Zoom again in the coming weeks. It was so nice to see all of you. My name is Yulia, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.